Today, grabbing a steak from the fridge or tossing leftovers into a Tupperware container is second nature. But for most of human history, food preservation was a battle against time, bacteria, and the elements. Without modern technology, our ancestors relied on ingenious techniques, methods that not only kept meat safe for months, but also created plenty of flavors and traditions that still influence our food today. How did our ancestors keep their meat fresh during long sea voyages? Why did medieval villagers hang sausages in their smoke-filled attics? And what does sealing meat in a layer of fat have to do with French fine dining? Stick around, people, as we uncover the ingenious ways our ancestors made meat last without the help of electricity. 1. Salt preservation, curing and brining. At number 1, we have the miracle of salt. For centuries, salt was one of the most valuable commodities in the world, not just for flavoring food, but for keeping it from spoiling. Before we had fridges, when fresh meat could spoil within days, salt became an essential tool for survival. By drawing moisture out of meat and creating an environment inhospitable to bacteria, salt preservation totally changed how people stored and consumed their food. Whether through dry curing, where meat is coated in salt and left to age, or brining, where it's submerged in a saltwater solution. This method was used across cultures and continents, ensuring that food could last not just for weeks, but for months or even years. I'm sorry, but you have to agree that that's insane. In ancient Egypt, salt was so highly prized that it was used in religious rituals. They even used it to embalm kings, guys. But beyond mummification, Egyptians also applied salt preservation techniques to their food, storing fish and meat for long journeys across the desert. The Romans later perfected the art of salting, establishing large salt works and salting fish, pork, and beef to feed their massive empire. They traded salted goods across Europe and Asia, cementing salt's role as an indispensable preservative. Meanwhile, in China, salted duck and pork became common, and traders carried salted fish along the Silk Road to distant markets. During the Middle Ages, salt preservation became common in European life, especially in colder regions where fresh meat was hard to come by in winter. Families would slaughter livestock in the fall and immediately coat the meat in salt, hanging it in cool cellars to dry and cure. This process didn't just prevent spoilage, it concentrated the flavors, leading to the development of some of the world's most cherished cured meats. Prosciutto in Italy, jamón ibérico in Spain, and bresaola in Switzerland all owe their origins to early salt preservation techniques. Even today, meats like salami, bacon, and corned beef trace their lineage back to these traditions. Beyond dry curing, brining also became a popular method of preserving meat, particularly among sailors and explorers. Mix salt and water, and boom, you had an effective means of keeping meat edible for long voyages. Ships carried barrels of salt pork and salt beef, which sustained sailors for months at sea. Without this innovation, long-distance exploration and trade, such as the voyages of Columbus and Magellan, would have been impossible. Even armies relied on salted meat during wartime, as it could be transported without fear of spoilage. Unfortunately, not everybody could afford salt, so it was pretty common for people to go with a more natural option. 2. Smoking. Before refrigeration, smoking was one of the most effective ways to preserve meat. What started as a practical necessity eventually made its way around to just about everywhere in the world. The process of smoking works in two critical ways. It dries out the meat, making it harder for bacteria to thrive, and the smoke itself contains antimicrobial compounds, like formaldehyde and phenols, which inhibit bacterial growth and add rich, smoky flavors. Some of the earliest evidence of smoked meat comes from prehistoric times, when early humans learned that hanging meat over a fire kept it edible longer. Like, come on, I could have discovered that too. Initially, this may have been accidental. Perhaps a hunter left a piece of meat too close to a fire and later found it tasted better and lasted longer than raw or sun-dried meat. Over time, this technique became something they did consciously, as people realized that exposure to smoke helped preserve food, making it keep for much longer. Indigenous peoples around the world developed their own smoking traditions. Native American tribes perfected the technique of smoking and drying buffalo, deer, and fish to make pemmican, a mixture of dried, smoked meat, fat, and berries that could last for months. I can't lie, that sounds delicious. In Scandinavia, Vikings smoked and dried fish to sustain themselves during long sea voyages. Meanwhile, in Africa, smoking was used to preserve game meats in regions where refrigeration was non-existent. The two main smoking methods, cold smoking and hot smoking, emerged as different cultures refined the technique. Cold smoking exposed meat to smoke at low temperatures, typically below 85 degrees or 30 degrees, drying it slowly quickly while imparting deep flavor. This method was common in Northern Europe, where stuff like salmon, ham, and sausages were smoked in cool, drafty smokehouses for weeks. Cold smoked meats usually needed additional curing or cooking before eating, but they could be stored for long periods without refrigeration. Hot smoking, on the other hand, used higher temperatures, between 165 to 225 degrees or 75 to 107 degrees, effectively cooking and preserving the meat at the same time. This technique became especially popular in places where immediate consumption was needed. Barbecue culture in the American South, for example, developed from the practice of hot smoking meats like pork and brisket, originally done out of necessity to make tough cuts of meat last longer. Throughout history, different woods were used to smoke meats and give them special flavors. Hickory, oak, and mesquite were popular in the Americas, while beechwood and alder were preferred in Europe. The type of wood burned in the smoking process influenced the final flavor of the meat, leading to regional variations in smoked foods. In medieval Europe, smokehouses became common, especially in villages where meat had to be stored through harsh winters. Every household had a designated area for smoking, and smoked meats like bacon, sausages, and ham were staples in peasant diets. Without refrigeration, people relied on the ability of smoke to preserve their food for months at a time. The practice of smoking also extended beyond meat. Fish was widely smoked in coastal communities, with Scottish smoked salmon, Norwegian gravlax, and Japanese katsuobushi, dried and smoked tuna, becoming prized delicacies. Even cheese and salt were sometimes smoked to enhance flavor and longevity. During the Age of Exploration, smoking helped sailors store food for long voyages. Many ships carried barrels of smoked fish and meats, allowing them to maintain protein-rich diets even without access to fresh food. Personally, I like the idea of reaching for some smoked meat when I need a snack. Smoking, combined with salting, became the primary method of meat preservation for centuries. Today, many of the world's most famous meats owe their flavor and texture to smoking. Texas barbecue brisket, German bratwurst, Polish kielbasa, Spanish chorizo, and even Italian speck all rely on smoking techniques perfected over hundreds of years. In the modern world, refrigeration has largely replaced smoking as a necessity for preservation, but the process is still celebrated for its unique taste and traditional appeal. People continue to build smokehouses, use backyard smokers, and experiment with different wood types to create bold, flavorful meats. Not unlike smoking, our next storage technique is just about as old as civilization itself. 3. Drying and dehydration.
Today I'm going to be making some dried meat over my wood stove.
Alright, picture this. It's 5,000 years ago. You just hunted a massive animal, and there's way more meat than you can eat before it starts rotting. You don't have a fridge, obviously, and there's no way you're letting that food go to waste. What do? You dry it out. Drying meat is probably the oldest food preservation trick in the book. It's simple. Take meat, remove moisture, let it sit in the sun or over a fire, boom, no more spoilage. Without moisture, bacteria can't do their nasty work, which means your food stays edible for months. No fancy chemicals, no refrigeration, just good old nature doing its thing. The key to drying meat is moisture removal. Bacteria need water to grow, and when meat is dried, it loses the moisture that microbes rely on to multiply. This makes dried meat one of the most shelf-stable foods, able to withstand harsh climates, long journeys, and extreme conditions. Early humans, whether in the deserts of Africa or the tundras of North America, discovered that properly dried meat could last indefinitely if stored correctly. Dried meat can travel even further than most people, in fact. Ancient people all over the world figured this out pretty early on. The indigenous tribes of North America, they made pemmican, thin strips of buffalo or deer meat dried in the sun, then mixed with fat and berries. This wasn't just survival food, it was an energy-dense food that turned hunters, warriors, and travelers into superhumans, enabling them to sustain themselves for weeks on end. Pemmican was so effective as a preserved meat that European fur traders and Arctic explorers adopted it for their own expeditions, realizing that no other preserved meat could last as long or provide as much nourishment. Meanwhile, in Africa, the technique of air-drying meat gave birth to biltong, a cured and dried beef or game meat still popular today. Unlike pemmican, which was pounded into a powder, biltong retained its structure, hanging in open-air environments to slowly dry over time. This method was especially useful in South Africa, where hot, dry conditions naturally aided the preservation process. European settlers in the region adopted the technique from native African tribes, incorporating vinegar, salt, and spices to improve flavor and longevity. In South America, a similar similar technique produced charqui, the Quechua word for dried, salted meat. Spanish conquistadors later brought this practice back to Europe, where it influenced the development of jerky, a term derived from charqui. Today, jerky remains one of the most widely consumed dried meats, with variations existing in nearly every culture. I eat jerky, you eat jerky, we all eat jerky. China also has a long tradition of drying meats, particularly lap chiong, a type of dried, cured sausage that dates back centuries. These sausages, made from pork and flavored with soy sauce, sugar, and rice wine, were hung in kitchens and allowed to air dry in cool, dry conditions. The result was a chewy, intensely flavored meat product that could be stored for months without spoiling. In the Middle East, kawarma, or kurma, was an early form of dried and preserved meat, often made from lamb or goat. This was particularly important for nomadic Bedouin tribes who needed a portable, long-lasting protein source in the desert. Kawarma was typically slow-cooked, then left to dry in the sun, or preserved in fat, ensuring that it could be eaten throughout the year. Europe also embraced the practice of drying meat, particularly in mountainous regions where cold, dry air helped with natural dehydration. Bresaola, a lean, air-dried beef from northern Italy, and pastirma, a highly spiced dried meat from Turkey and the Balkans, became regional specialties. Drying meat wasn't always as simple as leaving it out in the open. In humid climates, where the risk of spoilage was greater, people combined drying with salting or smoking to enhance preservation. Many cultures hung meat near a fire, allowing the warmth and gentle smoke to aid the drying process while adding a layer of antibacterial protection. This hybrid method led to some of the world's most famous cured meats, such as Spanish chorizo, Hungarian salami, and German Landjäger. Even today, dried meat remains one of the most widely consumed preserved foods in the world. From vacuum-sealed jerky in American supermarkets to handmade biltong in South African markets, drying is still considered one of the most effective, reliable, and natural ways to preserve meat. The process may have been refined over thousands of years, but the core principle remains unchanged. Remove the moisture, protect the protein, and create a food that can sustain people for generations. Drying was good, yeah? But sometimes people needed something with a bit more punch. 4. Fermentation. All right, I know what you're thinking. Fermented meat? That sounds questionable, but hear me out. Fermentation is basically controlled rotting, but also cool, and it's one of the oldest and most underrated ways to preserve meat. So, how does it work? Instead of letting the bad bacteria take over and ruin your dinner, you introduce good bacteria, like lactic acid bacteria, that change the meat's chemistry. These little guys create an acidic environment that stops the nasty bacteria from growing. Bonus: it also adds amazing flavors. Some of the world's most beloved meats, like salami, sopressata, and sujuk, owe their existence to fermentation. Fun fact: beer and wine also owe their existence to it. Thank you, fermentation. Across Europe, fermented meats became a dietary staple, especially in regions where fresh meat was hard to come by during the winter months. Villages developed their own methods, hanging sausages in cool cellars or aging them in caves to encourage natural bacterial cultures to do their work. This technique allowed meats to last for months, even years, while intensifying their flavors into something truly unique. The pungent, tangy notes found in Italian salami or the rich depth of Spanish chorizo exist because of carefully controlled fermentation, a process perfected over centuries. Asia also has its own long history of fermented meats, particularly in China and Korea, where pork and fish were frequently preserved this way. In Korea, dishes like jokbal, pig's feet cured in soy sauce and spices, developed as a result of fermentation techniques, allowing communities to store meat safely for long winters. In Thailand, sausages like sai krok isan are made by fermenting pork with sticky rice, where the natural sugars feed lactic acid bacteria to preserve the meat and create a deliciously sour flavor. While the science of fermentation wasn't fully understood until modern times, ancient people knew that allowing meat to ferment in the right conditions could make it last longer and taste even better. Even today, fermented meats remain an important part of global cuisine. What was once a method of necessity has turned into a celebrated culinary tradition, with certain fermented sausages considered gourmet delicacies. Though refrigeration has made meat storage easier, many of these age-old techniques remain unchanged, proving that fermentation wasn't just about preservation, but also flavor. If all that wasn't an option, storing food in fat usually was. 5. Fat preservation. All right, let's say you're living in medieval Europe and winter is coming. You've got a pig you just butchered and you need to make that meat last all winter without a fridge. What do? You drown it in fat. Yep, fat preservation was the medieval version of vacuum sealing. The idea was simple. Cook the meat slowly, pack it into a jar, then cover it with a thick layer of fat. No air equals no bacteria equals no spoilage. It's like creating a little time capsule for your food, and the best part, it actually made the meat taste amazing. The French were the absolute kings of this technique. Ever heard of duck confit? That's duck that has been slow cooked in its own fat until it's fall apart tender, then sealed under a layer of fat in a jar. Properly done, it could last months in a cool cellar. Though, let's be real, it was probably too delicious to last that long. But the French weren't the only ones doing this. In medieval England and Scotland, people made potted meats, shredded pork or beef mixed with butter or suet, then packed into clay pots and covered with even more fat. This wasn't just about storage. It was spreadable, meaty goodness, kind of like an old-school pâté. Beyond Europe, this technique had its place in various cultures. In parts of the Middle East, people preserved lamb by cooking it in its own fat and storing it in earthenware containers, ensuring they had protein reserves long after fresh meat was gone. In Africa, hunters would preserve game meat by slow cooking it in fat and sealing it inside gourds, allowing them to sustain themselves while traveling through harsh climates. Even Native American pemmican, though primarily a dried meat product, often contained animal fat as a binding and preserving agent. Have you ever thought about soaking some meat in rum? If not, brace up because your life is about to change. And 5. Alcohol and vinegar preservation. Let's be honest, alcohol and vinegar have a lot of great uses. They make food taste better, they help us unwind after a long day, and oh yeah, they can keep meat from rotting. Turns out, bacteria hate environments that are too acidic or too boozy, which makes both alcohol and vinegar perfect for meat preservation. This wasn't just a fun experiment. This was a survival strategy used by people all over the world. First up, vinegar. We've been pickling things for thousands of years, and meat is no exception. In ancient Rome, people preserved meats in vinegar-based brines spiced with herbs. The idea was that the acidity from the vinegar would kill off bacteria while also making the meat more flavorful. Fast forward a few centuries, and this technique gave us classics like corned beef, which was originally brined in a salty, vinegary mix to help it last on long sea voyages. Pickled meats weren't just a European thing either. In China, they developed vinegar-preserved pork, where cooked pork was soaked in a tangy, spiced vinegar bath. In the Philippines, vinegar-based marinades became the foundation of dishes like adobo, which started as a preservation technique before becoming a national dish. And then there's alcohol, because who knew booze could do more than just make parties fun? In medieval France, people stored meats in wine, beer, or even brandy. This wasn't just about getting drunk off your dinner, although that probably happened too. The alcohol worked as a preservative, killing bacteria and keeping the meat safe to eat for longer. One of the most famous examples? Pâté en croûte, a fancy French dish where meat and liver are packed into a pastry crust, with a layer of wine or brandy jelly sealing it off. The booze wasn't just for flavor, it was a way to keep the meat fresh. In England, people made boozy meat pies, where cooked beef or game was sealed under a thick layer of ale-based gravy. And in the Caribbean, sailors preserved meat in rum-soaked brines, which helped prevent spoilage during long sea voyages. Rum ham, anyone? Even today, we still use these methods, just in different ways. Vinegar is still a key ingredient in marinades, hello, barbecue, and adobo, and alcohol is used in everything from coq au vin to beer-braised brisket. What started as a way to stop meat from going bad turned into some of the most iconic flavors in global cuisine. So the next time you enjoy a pickled sausage or a wine-braised steak, just remember, that's history on your plate. And if you're feeling extra fancy, pour yourself a glass of wine and toast to the brilliant ancestors who figured out that booze and acid weren't just for drinking, they were for saving dinner too. Talk about saving dinner. Why don't we talk about how the frozen meat industry was already booming centuries before the first fridge was invented? 6. Snow and ice storage. All right, let's talk about nature's first freezer, snow and ice. Before electricity, before refrigerators, before we could just toss leftovers into a Tupperware and call it a day, people had to get creative to keep their meat from turning into a bacterial science experiment. And what better way to keep food fresh than by using the one thing that's literally designed to keep stuff cold? Ice. If you lived in a cold climate, you had a huge advantage when it came to food storage. The Inuit, for example, figured out that if you buried freshly hunted seal or fish in the permafrost, it would stay good for months, essentially nature's deep freezer. But they didn't just store food in ice, they also used ice as food. Yep, ever heard of iguanak? It's a traditional Inuit dish where meat is buried under snow and left to ferment before being eaten raw. Sounds intense, but when you don't have an oven, you get creative. But let's say you weren't lucky enough to live somewhere with year-round ice. No problem. Ancient civilizations had a plan for that too. Enter the ice house. Way back in 400 BC, the Persians were out here engineering giant underground yakhchals, which, by the way, Sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie, but they were actually massive domed structures built to store ice all year long. These things were designed so well that even in the blistering desert heat, the ice inside would stay frozen. How? Thick insulated walls, underground storage, and some seriously smart airflow designs. These weren't just for keeping drinks cold either. The Persians stored meat, dairy, and even made ice cream long before Ben & Jerry's existed. Fast forward a few centuries, and Europeans got in on the action too. By the Middle Ages, wealthy landowners had ice cellars, deep underground storage rooms where they packed ice harvested from frozen lakes in winter. They'd layer it with straw, sawdust, or hay to slow down melting, and boom, cold storage before electricity was even a thing. Now, this worked great if you were a rich noble with an ice pit in your backyard, but what about regular people? Enter the ice trade. Yes, ice became so valuable in the 19th century that people literally started selling it like a luxury item. One of the biggest players in this game was Frederick Tudor, aka the Ice King, a Boston businessman who made an entire fortune shipping blocks of ice from frozen lakes in New England to tropical places like the Caribbean and even India. That's right, people in India were chilling their drinks with ice harvested in Massachusetts. And this wasn't some rare one-time thing. By the mid-1800s, millions of tons of ice were being shipped around the world every year. Of course, the ice trade didn't last forever. Once mechanical refrigeration was invented in the late 19th century, buying ice blocks became way less appealing. By the early 1900s, electric refrigerators started creeping into homes, and by the 1930s, most Americans had one. By the 1950s, the global ice trade was pretty much dead. But here's the wild part. Natural ice storage never fully disappeared. Even today, there are places that still rely on ice houses, underground cellars, and even permafrost pits for food storage. In remote Arctic communities, people still use frozen earth to store meat for months. Because hey, why pay for electricity when Mother Nature is giving you free cold storage? So the next time you grab something from your freezer, just remember, you're using a technology that humans have been perfecting for thousands of years. The only difference? You don't have to dig an ice pit in your backyard to do it. Talk about digging a pit. This last storage method will have you wondering who thought of it. Chapter 7. Ash and clay. We've talked about salting, smoking, drying, freezing, all that good stuff. But what if I told you that some people preserved meat by literally burying it in dirt, coating it in ashes, or wrapping it in clay? Sounds insane, right? Well, welcome to the MacGyver level of food preservation, where people figured out how to use the earth itself to keep their food from rotting. Let's start with ash preservation. Because yeah, that stuff left over from your campfire, turns out it's an ancient food storage hack. Civilizations all over the world discovered that coating meat in ash did two things: kept bugs and bacteria away, because let's be real, nothing wants to live in ashes, and created an alkaline environment that slowed down spoilage. In parts of Africa, people packed meat in wood ash to protect it from heat and insects. In Europe, ash-covered ham was a thing. Spanish jamón ibérico and French ash-cured ham are basically fancy, gourmet versions of what was once just a practical survival technique. Even in some indigenous cultures in North America, ash was sprinkled over dried meat to keep it safe from pests and moisture. But let's level up. What if instead of coating the meat in something, you straight up buried it? Welcome to clay preservation. Ancient Chinese and Egyptian civilizations discovered that if you wrapped meat in a thick layer of clay and let it harden, it would completely seal off the meat from air and bacteria. No oxygen, no rot. Simple as that. And when it was time to eat, just crack the clay open like a piñata. One of the most famous versions of this is beggar's chicken, a Chinese dish where a whole chicken is wrapped in lotus leaves, covered in clay, and baked. Originally, this wasn't some fancy gourmet dish. It was a survival trick. Poor travelers and beggars, hence the name, would bury their food in clay to keep it from spoiling, then cook it right in its clay shell when they were ready to eat. Not only did this method preserve the meat, but it also made it super tender and juicy, kind of like nature's slow cooker. Now, what if you didn't have clay or ash? No problem. Just bury the meat straight in the ground. This method was huge among nomadic and desert cultures, where cool underground temperatures helped keep food fresh way longer than leaving it out in the open. In Mongolia, warriors would bury slabs of meat under cold earth to preserve them during long campaigns. In the Middle East, buried lamb and goat meat was often stored underground in clay pots, sealed with fat or wax to keep the air out. Even today, some of these ancient techniques still exist. Ash-cured meats are now considered gourmet. Clay-baked dishes like beggar's chicken have gone from survival food to five-star restaurant meals. And buried meat? Still a thing in remote parts of the world because hey, if it worked for thousands of years, why stop now? Our ancestors may not have had refrigerators, but they had something just as valuable: knowledge, patience, and the ability to work with nature to preserve food in the most creative ways possible. So, what do you think? Have you ever tried preserving meat using one of these traditional methods? Which one fascinates you the most? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into food history, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more fascinating stories from the past. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.